The twin suns of Careth 9 were already sliding toward the jagged horizon when the survival instructors ordered the mixed-species cadets to begin constructing their overnight shelters. The air shimmered with heat, and the dunes stretched in every direction like an endless golden ocean, broken only by the occasional dark streak where the wind had exposed layers of mineral-rich sand. Every cadet had been warned that night temperatures on Careth 9 dropped fast enough to freeze exposed skin within an hour, and the predators that roamed beneath the surface surfaced most aggressively after sunset. The only way to survive the night was to have a shelter sturdy enough to break the airflow above one's body and stable enough to shield from burrowing creatures. The alien cadets immediately panicked at the limitation. They had energy cells, collapsible metallic frames, and thermal fabric, but every structure depended on anchoring into sand. The instructors had not revealed the planet's most dangerous secret, and the cadets still believed the task would be routine. Mason Hale, the only human in the group, stood slightly apart from the others, gripping the straps of his pack and narrowing his eyes at the dunes. He had the calm posture of someone who had already accepted that the rules of this world would be different. Sand trembling beneath his boots told him more than any briefing could have. Most of the alien cadets rushed into action immediately, each relying on the tools and instincts of his or her species. A tall, crystalline-skinned cadet named Sorel hammered metallic stakes into the dune with long, sharp arms. A smaller, pale blue cadet from a water-adapted world sprayed a thick gelatinous adhesive under a thermal canopy, trying to anchor it in place. Others began assembling dome frames with magnetized joints. Their shelters rose quickly, gleaming under the fading sunlight. The instructors watched from a ridge, making notes and whispering among themselves, waiting for the moment the cadets would learn why this world had the highest mortality rate of all training environments. Mason did not move. He crouched low, scooped a handful of sand, and let it fall through his fingers. Most worlds had some degree of seismic activity, but this sand pulsed faintly with something alive. Each vibration traveled upward like a tiny heartbeat. When he pressed his palm deeper, he felt a slight pull, as if the sand itself exhaled. He had felt similar sensations on predator-dense Earth environments where burrowing animals tracked prey by pressure changes, and Careth 9 felt like a scaled-up version of that instinct. He rose to his feet slowly, scanning the cadets' shelters. Every structure created weight. Every footstep compacted the dunes. Every strike of a hammer sent another vibration downward, broadcasting the exact message no one wanted to send. Prey is here. The first warning sign came when the dunes to the west bowed inward. Sand poured down like water being drained from a basin. Several cadets froze, staring at the depression as it grew deeper and wider. Mason recognized the pattern instantly. It was the same type of collapse he had seen in desert documentaries when a burrowing predator shifted beneath the sand. But this time, the collapse did not stop. A tremor rippled outward, lifting the sand around the depression like a bulge rising through a liquid surface. One of the crystalline-skinned cadets shouted something, but the sound was swallowed by the sudden roar of shifting earth. A gigantic sandworm erupted upward in a plume of sand that blocked out both suns. Its circular maw opened like a spiraling tunnel lined with rings of jagged teeth. The creature launched itself headfirst into Sorel's almost finished shelter, swallowing the entire frame in a single gulp. Metal shrieked as it collapsed inward. The cadet fell backward with a scream, scrambling away from the creature's shadow as it dove back underground, leaving a jagged ripple of disturbed sand stretching toward the horizon. Before the first wave of panic could settle, a second sandworm burst out from beneath another group of cadets, devouring their dome before it had even been fully raised. The predators were not hunting cadets specifically. They were targeting anything that created prolonged pressure or structure on the sand. The shelters were nothing more than beacons calling them to strike. The dunes exploded in multiple places at once. One cadet from a lightweight avian species attempted to sprint across the dune crest, but every step he took sent a deeper vibration downward. A sandworm lunged up from beneath him, its maw snapping shut just seconds after he managed to leap aside. He hit the ground rolling, feathers coated with clumps of sand, screaming for help. Another cadet hurled a thermal anchor into the ground, hoping to stabilize herself long enough to retreat, but the moment the anchor penetrated the surface, the sand around it convulsed violently. A worm surged upward, swallowing the anchor and nearly taking her with it. She barely escaped by throwing herself backward, landing in a chaotic tumble down the side of the dune. Mason did not run. He sidestepped slowly, keeping his weight evenly distributed, avoiding sharp downward pressure with each movement. He could feel the tremors beneath him intensifying as more worms converged on the area. The shelters, still partially standing, vibrated like trapped prey signaling distress. The dunes shook with the rhythm of predators responding. He watched a third worm drive upward and clamp its ringed teeth around a thermal canopy, shredding it instantly. Sand geysers shot dozens of meters into the air as the predators tore apart anything structural, metallic, or weighted enough to resemble a hiding place. The instructors on the ridge remained in place, watching silently, making no effort to intervene. This was the moment they wanted the cadets to experience, a demonstration that traditional construction methods meant nothing on Careth 9. Mason glanced toward them briefly and noticed one instructor looking directly at him, waiting to see how the human would react. She did not shout directions or call for retreat. She merely observed, analyzing whether he understood the planet's rules faster than the others. Most cadets fled aimlessly, tripping over dunes, shouting warnings, or trying to dismantle their collapsing shelters to reduce the vibrations. But the worms did not discriminate. They surged toward any disturbance, striking at metal fragments, discarded framework, and even the echo of footsteps. The sun dipped lower, casting elongated shadows across the sands. Night approached, and with it came colder winds and more aggressive predators. Mason inhaled deeply and forced himself to remain still long enough to study each tremor. He realized the worms did not always attack living beings directly. They responded almost exclusively to structured pressure, anything that weighed enough to distort the surface. A single cadet running lightly was less interesting to them than a cluster of tools piled together. A partially built shelter was a direct invitation. He lowered himself to one knee, gently pressing his fingertips into the surface, measuring the pattern. The vibrations from the worms moved in arcs, sweeping through the area as they searched for pressure signatures. The shelters, or what remained of them, acted like lures. The predators destroyed them one after another, sometimes diving up, sometimes bursting sideways through dunes, until the entire field of structures had been wiped clean. The cadets, realizing nothing they built survived longer than a minute, were left exposed, scattered, and terrified. Some huddled together on bare sand, trembling despite knowing movement would only call more attention. Mason finally rose from his crouch, dusting his palms. He had seen enough. The predators were not mindless. They followed patterns. They reacted to depth, distribution of weight, and changes in the sand's tension. And if that was true, then there was a way to survive. Not by resisting the worms, but by making them believe their work was already finished. The desert fell quiet again, except for the fading rumble of worms tunneling away. The cadets stared hopelessly at the ruins of their shelters, realizing they had nothing left to protect them from the coming night. Mason looked at the dunes and felt the pressured rhythm beneath them, already imagining the shape of a solution, one the others had no reason yet to trust. The planet had revealed its rules. Now he only needed to play by them. Mason remained kneeling on the dune long after the last visible sandworm vanished beneath the surface. The air vibrated with leftover tremors, and every shift of the sand carried the echo of the predators returning to deeper tunnels. The twin suns continued to sink, casting long shadows between the dunes, and the wind carried a sharp bite that warned of the night to come. The other cadets stayed clustered in scattered groups, shaken and exhausted. Some sat motionless, staring at the dunes with wide, terrified eyes. Others whispered quick, frantic questions to one another, trying to make sense of what had happened. Mason watched them from a distance, knowing the panic simmering through the group would soon boil over unless he pieced together the last clues he needed. He sank his hand into the sand again and felt the faint residual tremors fading like ripples on a pond after a stone had been thrown. He pressed deeper, flattening his palm, and held his breath. The tension under the surface grew lighter the closer he brought his hand to the dune's contour without adding weight. When he fully released pressure, spreading his palm wide and keeping his arm relaxed, the sandworm's awareness below him eased. He repeated the motion several times, testing the sand the way a diver tests water before jumping in. Each light movement produced no response. Each pressed movement created a faint shift, as if something below registered the change. To isolate the effect, he rose to his feet and stepped deliberately, heel first. A subtle pulse drifted under him. He stepped again, heavier. The response was stronger, traveling in a diagonal line far beneath the dune. He crouched low, placed his hand against the sand, and felt for return tremors. Nothing immediate. The worm had not turned back. Mason nodded to himself. It had only reacted earlier because the shelters created concentrated weight, not because individual cadets walked around lightly. That was the first important distinction. He moved closer to a small cluster of cadets huddled near a slope. A young female cadet with dark purple skin and translucent fins along her neck watched him approach with wide, uncertain eyes. She seemed too afraid to speak, so he slowed his steps to show he meant no harm. Another cadet nearby, a short male with metallic-looking scales, leaned back when Mason approached, as if bracing for another disaster. Mason kept his voice even and calm. He told them to stay exactly where they were and not to shift suddenly. Both listened, though neither understood why. He took a small, broken piece of frame lying half-buried beside them. The jagged metal still carried the imprint of whatever creature had bitten through it. Mason held it carefully by the edge and placed it on the sand a meter away. He applied the smallest possible pressure, settling it vertically. The effect was immediate. The sand quivered sharply beneath the object, and a faint, accelerating tremor responded. The two cadets stiffened, instinctively pulling closer to the dune. Mason kept his voice low and firm, ordering them not to move. The tremor grew stronger, rushed forward, and then paused. The vibration shifted direction, veering slightly off-center and weakening. The metal piece had not been heavy enough. Mason retrieved it and repositioned it horizontally. The wider surface distributed the weight differently, and the sand reacted with a deeper pulse. Within seconds, the tremor grew fast enough that the two cadets began to panic. Mason slammed his hand down flat near the metal, spreading his fingers wide to redistribute the pressure. The tremor immediately softened and drifted away. The worms recognized the sudden change as something collapsing rather than something standing. That was the second key detail. Pressure distribution changed the predator's behavior dramatically. As he rose, the purple-skinned cadet whispered a shaky question, asking how he knew the worms would not surge upward after him. Mason explained that the worms sensed density differences, not minor movements. Her breath steadied a little when she realized he had not been acting blindly. She nodded once, grateful, but still scared. Mason did not linger. He had more to test, and dusk pushed closer by the minute. He moved toward a shallow erosion pit not far away, a wind-carved depression wide enough for 3 cadets to lie in. He stepped into the center, lowering his body slowly, and felt the air cool around him as the dune walls blocked some of the wind. The sand beneath him remained calm. No tremor responded to his presence. He shifted forward, leaned his weight to one knee, and felt a faint pulse. He shifted backward into a wider stance, distributing his mass evenly. The pulse disappeared again. He exhaled slowly. That confirmed it. Shallow depressions neutralized pressure signatures. Predators could not sense anything inside unless a cadet created sudden, sharp weight. He climbed out, brushed sand from his hands, and scanned the area for anything else he could use. Several cadets wandered near the edges of the camp, searching for their instructors or for materials to rebuild, but the instructors remained motionless on the ridge. They intended to let the cadets confront the planet's rules themselves. Mason did not blame them. Training environments were supposed to be brutal. Lessons that kept cadets alive on real missions needed to be learned hard. He walked toward a small mound of sand disturbed by the earlier attacks. When he pressed lightly with his boot, a faint tremor responded. When he pressed harder, the tremor strengthened. He repeated the process several times, testing the worm's sensitivity. Eventually, he crouched and dug shallow grooves with his fingers, creating circular patterns like collapsed tunnels. When he stepped around the grooves, the vibrations weakened significantly. When he stepped closer, they normalized. The worms ignored depressions, but reacted instantly to raised pressure. That was the third piece of the puzzle. The predators interpreted collapsed shapes as something already consumed. A shadow passed over the dunes as the suns sank lower. The wind howled softly between dune crests, lifting fine particles into the air. Temperature began to fall. Cadets huddled tighter, whispering anxiously about how they would survive the night without shelters. Mason felt the urgency closing in like a tightening fist. He needed a plan soon, not just for himself, but for everyone. Even if some cadets feared him or underestimated him, he knew leaving them exposed would lead to fatalities before morning. He climbed a tall dune and crouched at the crest to observe the terrain more clearly. From that vantage point, he could see faint trails left by sandworms, curving patterns beneath the surface that marked their roaming paths. He watched as several trails crossed, forming corridors underground. He studied the direction of each tremor, mapping paths mentally. The worms moved predictably once he understood their rhythm. They patrolled outward first, then circled back toward the densest pressure areas. He needed to redirect that instinct, not confront it. As he studied the shifting shadows, he realized that the dunes formed natural rings, where wind erosion carved shallow hollows. If used correctly, these depressions could create the illusion of collapsed shelters, abandoned, already destroyed. And if cadets stayed inside deeper hollows with evenly distributed weight, the worms would overlook them entirely. The idea began forming in his mind with startling clarity. A decoy village, not a real one. A fake one carved into the dunes, shaped to mimic the aftermath of a full-scale sandworm feeding site. If the predators believed the area had already been consumed, they would patrol past it rather than attack again. The challenge would be speed. The suns were minutes from setting, and the temperature continued dropping. His breath already fogged in front of him. The cadets would freeze before dawn if he did not find a way to protect them. He slid down the dune, landing lightly, and jogged toward the scattered group. Several cadets turned toward him with desperate expressions, some expecting answers, others too afraid to hope. He told them to listen closely and not panic. At first, his voice carried no authority over them, but the calm steadiness in his expression made even those who doubted him pause. He explained quickly but precisely. The sandworms attacked shelters because of dense pressure, not movement. Shallow pits were ignored. Depressions resembling previous collapses were dismissed entirely. A male cadet with brilliant silver scales stared at Mason with disbelief, asking how he could know all of that. Mason simply told him that the dunes revealed more than the predators intended. Another cadet chimed in, questioning whether he truly expected them to dig their way out of danger. Mason replied that digging was the safest action they could take, because it erased pressure and mimicked destruction. Some cadets hesitated. Some shook visibly with cold and fear. But Mason spoke with a certainty none of them possessed, and gradually, one by one, they realized he was the only one who had been studying the planet instead of running from it. The purple-skinned cadet was the first to nod in agreement, stepping closer to him with a determined expression despite her trembling hands. The others followed reluctantly but hopefully. Night loomed over the dunes like a heavy curtain being drawn across the world, and as the last light thinned across the horizon, Mason straightened his posture and began outlining the plan that would determine whether the entire group survived until dawn. The Sandworms had exposed their rules. Now he would exploit them. Mason stood at the center of the frightened group, the wind tugging at his clothes as the twin suns dipped lower, staining the dunes in shades of deep orange and purple. The temperature continued its sharp plunge. Each breath he exhaled formed a brief, pale cloud before vanishing into the cold. The cadets watched him with a tense silence, clinging to his every movement. Some shivered violently, though he could not tell whether it was from fear or the rapid onset of the freezing night. He knew the window for preparation was narrowing with every passing minute. He needed them focused, coordinated, and ready to work as one. He began by kneeling on the sand and drawing a rough outline with his finger. The aliens leaned in, forming a circle around him. The plan was simple in theory, but depended on them trusting him entirely. He explained that the group needed to create a ring of shallow depressions wide enough to resemble collapsed shelters. The dunes carried natural wind-carved pits, but those were not enough. The predators needed to believe that the cadets had built a full encampment that had already been consumed. The illusion had to be convincing, complete, and large enough to redirect a pack of sandworms. The cadets' faces shifted between confusion, skepticism, and dawning hope as he spoke. Some whispered quietly to one another, questioning whether this could work, but none interrupted him. He moved his hand across the sand, marking where the outer ring would be. Each mark represented a pit. Once those were dug, the cadets would carve irregular edges to mimic the chaotic way the worms shredded real shelters. The alien cadets stared at the sketch, then at the surrounding dunes, trying to connect the abstract lines to the dangerous environment. Mason pointed toward a series of shallow depressions formed by the wind. Those natural formations would serve as part of the ring, but many more were needed to complete a believable circle. He instructed each cadet to dig pits no deeper than chest level and no narrower than 2 meters. The worms ignored depressions, but responded violently to any raised weight or structure. That meant the edges needed to slope gently, keeping pressure naturally low. A male cadet with orange scales stepped forward and asked who would build the inner chamber where everyone would hide. Mason told him that he would handle that himself, with the help of anyone who could keep calm under pressure. The purple-skinned cadet immediately volunteered. She had fear in her eyes, but she forced her voice to remain steady. Mason nodded approvingly. He appreciated her willingness to step forward when others still hesitated. Her decision encouraged 2 more cadets to join in. He split the group. Half would begin digging the ring of decoy pits. The other half would help him carve the center chamber. He reminded them all to move slowly, distribute their weight, and avoid stamping or slipping. A careless footstep could attract a worm. The aliens listened with a seriousness none had shown earlier in the day. With instructions clear, the cadets dispersed across the chosen area. The dune vibrated lightly beneath the coordinated movements of so many bodies, but Mason felt the tremors remain shallow. As long as no one created sudden, concentrated pressure, the worms would not investigate. He moved toward the center of the chosen ring and pressed his palm firmly against the sand, gauging its consistency. The dune curved gently downward, offering a natural foundation for a wide, low-pressure hollow. The chamber he envisioned would resemble a crater. Its floor would be wide enough for all cadets to lie or sit together without creating a single concentrated point. He knelt beside the purple-skinned cadet, who introduced herself as Lyrae, with a soft, tremulous voice. She asked what shape the chamber needed to take. Mason explained that it should resemble a fallen dune crest, smooth in some areas and jagged in others, but overall broad and shallow. The goal was to distribute weight so evenly that the dunes would barely register any disturbance. Lyrae nodded and immediately began tracing the outline with her hands. 2 additional cadets, a tall male with segmented armor plating along his back and a small female with crystalline ridges on her forehead, joined them. Mason instructed them to dig outward first, not downward, and to keep their movements steady and fluid. The armored male worked methodically, using his heavy limbs to push sand aside in consistent motions. The crystalline female moved quickly, but with surprising precision, shaping the slope with her delicate fingers. Mason oversaw their rhythm, occasionally pausing them when their digging became too forceful. Each time he placed a hand on the sand to feel for tremors. The silence below reassured him that the worms had not yet narrowed in on the disturbance. Meanwhile, along the outer edges, the other cadets were carving their decoy pits. Mason glanced up frequently, watching them shape the dunes into what looked like the aftermath of a devastating feeding frenzy. Some cadets threw themselves fully into the task, driven by urgency. Others moved slower, weighed down by fear. But all understood that their survival depended on the ring looking authentic. Mason shouted occasional instructions. Widen the rim, smooth the slope, make the angle irregular. The aliens obeyed, forming a ring that slowly transformed into something disturbingly organic. It looked like the ground had already been ravaged. That was exactly what he needed. As the temperature continued dropping, the wind gained strength. It swept across the desert, dragging long trails of sand. The shifting air patterns helped disguise the cadets' movements, blending their disturbances into broader dunes. Mason used the wind to his advantage. Where the gusts created natural ridges, he altered the chamber's edges to match. He wanted nothing to appear deliberately carved. He wanted the predators to see only destruction. Lyrae looked up at him several times, seeking reassurance that they were doing it correctly. Each time he nodded, grounding her confidence. She worked harder afterward, shaping the sand with renewed determination. Her hands trembled from the cold, but she ignored the discomfort. Mason recognized that bravery and silently approved. When the outline of the chamber was complete, he stepped into the center. The hollow was large, nearly 5 meters across. The sloping walls shielded the space from wind, and the sand felt unusually still beneath him. He crouched and pressed both palms into the ground, waiting for tremors. None came. The chamber's width and gradual incline spread his weight so perfectly that the dunes treated him as part of the landscape. He stood and instructed the others to begin smoothing the edges from the inside out. The armored male cadet pressed broad strokes along the slope, mimicking natural collapse patterns. Lyrae worked along the rim, creating subtle asymmetry. Mason added irregular dips along the wall, reinforcing the illusion of a fallen dune. Slowly, the chamber took on the appearance of something formed by nature rather than hands. When he finally stepped back, the circle of decoy pits surrounded him like ghostly scars on the desert. The aliens stood around the edges, breathing hard and trembling from the cold. Mason scanned the area carefully, noting the realism. The broken edges, the scattered fragments of sand, the varying depths, all convincingly resembled an abandoned camp that had already been destroyed. He nodded to himself. If the worms circled the area and sensed these depressions, they would assume this place had been consumed. They would move on, searching elsewhere for prey. He turned toward the cadets and signaled them to gather inside the central hollow. They descended slowly, each one moving with visible fear, but also relief at having something resembling a shelter. As more bodies filled the chamber, Mason monitored the pressure. The hollow absorbed the weight well. Even with more than 20 cadets inside, the dunes did not pulse with warning vibrations. Once everyone settled, Mason knelt near the rim of the chamber. He placed his palm on the sand and closed his eyes, listening. The dunes remained silent. The worms had not yet changed direction, but the night was far from over. The predators would return soon, drawn by earlier disturbances. And when they did, the success or failure of his plan would determine whether every being in this chamber lived to see dawn. Still, for the first time since arriving on Careth 9, the cadets looked at him not with confusion or fear, but with trust. The ring of fake structures gleamed faintly under the last dying light. The chamber cradled them like a fragile heartbeat protected by sand. Mason exhaled slowly, steadied his breathing, and prepared for the night ahead. The fake village was ready. Now all that remained was to see if the planet's predators would believe the lie. The last traces of daylight bled away behind the serrated horizon, and the desert of Careth 9 fell into a darkness so complete that even the brightest stars looked muted behind thin sheets of airborne dust. The temperature plummeted with merciless speed. Frost formed along the crests of the dunes, catching what little moonlight reflected from the two pale satellites drifting overhead. The cadets inside the central hollow shivered violently, some clutching their arms, others drawing their legs close to their bodies as the cold gnawed at exposed skin. Mason remained near the rim, half sitting, half kneeling, his eyes fixed on the shifting shadows beyond the ring of fake pits. He felt the sand with one hand every few seconds, searching for the first tremor that would mark the predator's return. Wind swept across the desert in long, uneven gusts, carrying a low moan that almost resembled voices whispering across the dunes. The cadets flinched at each sound. Mason breathed slowly, keeping his movements controlled and quiet. He spoke only when necessary, urging the cadets to stay still, to breathe evenly, to resist the instinct to huddle upward in search of warmth. Rising even a little would create localized pressure the worms could detect. The hollow was safe only as long as the weight remained spread across its wide floor. The aliens obeyed, though some did so only because fear left them too stiff to rise anyway. Then the first tremor came. It started faintly, a soft quiver beneath the edge of Mason's palm. He froze immediately, lowering his body even closer to the sand. He felt the tremor roll beneath him like a deep, muffled growl. The cadets sensed the shift as well. Quiet gasps rippled through the chamber, followed by absolute silence. Mason motioned for them not to move, then pressed his ear to the sand. The vibration grew steadily stronger, traveling in a sweeping arc around the perimeter of the dunes. The worms were not directly beneath them yet, but they were approaching fast, responding to the echo of the cadets' earlier activity. A second tremor appeared, this one approaching from a different direction. Mason's pulse quickened. 2 worms above ground meant the predators were coordinating a sweep. More tremors followed, overlapping, merging into a rhythmic pattern that made the sand feel alive beneath him. He lifted his head slowly. Lyrae, sitting only a few steps behind him, looked at him with wide, frightened eyes. He mouthed a single instruction: "Stay down." She nodded, her body shaking with cold and dread. The dunes around the fake ring changed shape as the vibrations intensified. Sand shifted like water disturbed by a storm. Then, with a sudden burst, a massive sandworm lunged upward from beneath one of the decoy pits. Its enormous body rose in a spiral of dust, teeth glinting in the faint moonlight as it crushed the depression in a violent surge. The cadets flinched, but Mason remained still, watching every movement with razor focus. The worm's body crashed back down, sending a shockwave through the dunes that rattled the hollow. But the predator did not turn toward the chamber. It dove again, vanishing beneath the sand in less than 2 seconds. A second worm erupted moments later near another decoy pit. Its emergence shook the ground so violently that several cadets had to cover their mouths to avoid screaming. Mason pressed both palms to the sand, making his weight flat and wide, ensuring that no sudden compression betrayed the chamber's true nature. When the second worm dove, the third surfaced, then a fourth, each bursting from the dunes with terrifying force, directing their attacks exclusively toward the decoy ring. The effect was exactly what Mason intended. The predators believed they were completing a feeding cycle. The earlier disturbances had led them here, and the fake pits appeared to them like the remains of shelters already destroyed. The worms struck aggressively, tearing through the ring again and again, consuming nothing but air and sand, yet convinced that they were eliminating the last traces of intruders. One worm surfaced so close to the hollow that Lyrae gasped involuntarily and clamped both hands over her mouth. The creature's body towered above the dune crest, its armored rings scraping against each other with a metallic screech. Its spiraled mouth opened wide enough to swallow a small transport vehicle. Mason could smell the bitter chemical scent, coming from the creature's digestive folds, sharp enough to sting his throat. The worm hesitated at the top of its rise, twisting its enormous body with slow, deliberate movements as if tasting the vibrations in the air. Mason flattened himself instantly, arms outstretched, head down. He whispered harshly for everyone to follow his motion. The cadets did, dropping low, pressing their bodies against the sand. The hollow absorbed the impact of their collective weight. The warmth of the bodies was trapped low, spreading thin, not rising in pockets that could betray movement. The worm remained above the surface for a moment longer. Its body undulated in a slow circle. For an agonizing second, Mason believed the creature had detected something, but then it turned sharply, diving into a nearby pit with a thunderous crash. Sand flew in every direction. The chamber trembled violently, but still the predators struck only the decoys. Minutes passed like hours. The worms continued their assault, smashing the false village again and again, each attack marking another test of Mason's plan. The temperature continued to drop. Frost began forming along the chamber's sloped edges. The cadets huddled as close as the chamber shape allowed, trembling with cold and terror. Mason fought to keep his mind clear. He pressed his hand to the sand repeatedly, listening to the shifts of the predators beneath. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, the frequency of the tremors changed. The worms moved farther from the ring. Their patterns slowed, lost urgency. The earlier frenzy gave way to broad, sweeping patrol routes. When one worm resurfaced for the final time, its emergence was less frantic and more routine. It rose halfway out of the sand, pivoted, then sank again without attacking. Mason realized the predators were satisfied. They believed the encampment had been obliterated. The tremors gradually drifted outward, scattering across the dunes. The vibrations weakened until they felt like distant vibrations rather than immediate threats. Mason exhaled slowly. He allowed his shoulders to relax for the first time since nightfall. The cadets noticed the shift in his posture and looked around nervously, trying to determine whether the danger had passed. He lowered himself fully to the sand, listening one last time. When he felt only the natural hum of the shifting dunes and no predator signatures, he lifted his head and whispered that the cadets could breathe more freely now. Some collapsed from the intensity of the fear they had been holding back. Others cried silently, overwhelmed with relief. Lyrae looked at Mason with a mix of awe and disbelief, her voice breaking as she whispered gratitude. He simply nodded. Gratitude meant little out here. Survival still depended on discipline until dawn arrived. He instructed everyone to stay in the hollow, conserve heat, and avoid any sudden movements. The predators had accepted the illusion, but a single mistake could bring them back. The wind continued sweeping frost across the dunes, and the desert remained deadly. But the most dangerous part of the night was over. As the moons slowly traced their path across the sky, casting pale arcs of light, Mason stayed awake at the rim of the chamber. He fought exhaustion, listening to the sand, ready to act if a worm circled back unexpectedly. But the predators stayed gone. The fake village had worked. When frost began melting into faint glimmers of dawn light on the dunes, Mason finally allowed himself to breathe deeply. The desert had survived the night, and so had they. The plan had held. The predators had been fooled. Dawn, at last, approached. The first hint of dawn crept across the dunes as a pale shimmer rather than a burst of light. On Careth 9, sunrise always began quietly, with frost melting into thin rivulets that glided down the sloped sands before vanishing beneath the surface. Mason lifted his head slowly, blinking against the faint brightness. His muscles ached from maintaining the same position for most of the night, but he forced himself to stay still until he felt confident that no predator moved beneath the chamber. The cadets around him stirred, shivering from cold and exhaustion, their breathing shallow and uneven. Relief lingered in the air, but so did the instinctive fear that the worms might return at any moment. He rested his palm gently on the sand. It felt still, so still that it resembled a surface untouched by anything alive. The deep tremors of the night had faded to nothing more than the natural vibration of cooling dunes. Mason exhaled softly, not daring to speak yet. He scanned the horizon. The twin suns had not fully risen, but the brighter of the two cast thin streaks of gold along the tops of the dunes, revealing the devastated ring of decoy pits surrounding them. The pits looked perfect in the morning light, ragged, uneven, torn open in jagged spirals. Some pits had collapsed completely, forming chaotic swirls of sand as if shredded by massive forces. Others bore the distinct circular impressions left by sandworm strikes. Mason studied each depression carefully, ensuring that none of the patterns looked fresh enough to attract new predators. The worms had attacked with such intensity that the entire ring resembled the aftermath of a brutal hunt. The illusions he had created were no longer illusions. The worms themselves had sculpted the final details. A soft voice broke the silence behind him. Lyrae had lifted her head, her breath forming a faint mist as she whispered Mason's name. Her purple skin had lost much of its warmth during the night, but her eyes carried something new, confidence, or perhaps disbelief that she had lived through the trial. He turned toward her, offering a slight nod to show that it was safe to move now. She pushed herself upright slowly, adjusting her weight with caution. Her fins fluttered weakly in the cold, but the relief on her face grew with every breath of warm air drifting into the chamber. One by one the cadets followed, lifting their heads, stretching stiff limbs, and rediscovering their voices in small murmurs. Some cried quietly, overwhelmed by exhaustion. Others stared at the dune walls in stunned silence, unsure how to process the fact that they were alive at all. A male cadet with silver scales pressed a trembling hand against the ground, then looked at Mason as though seeing him for the first time. Mason acknowledged him with a simple tilt of his head. Gratitude radiated from the cadet's posture, though he struggled to find the words. As the sun continued climbing, light spilled fully into the hollow, draining the last remnants of frost. The warmth allowed the cadets to sit upright without fear. Mason stood first, rising slowly to make sure the dunes responded with the same calm he felt beneath his feet. When he sensed no hidden tremors, he motioned for the others to rise as well. The entire group stood within the hollow, blinking against the growing brightness, their bodies shaking, but their expressions filled with astonished relief. Mason climbed the slope to the rim and scanned the desert again. The dunes stretched endlessly, soft and untouched except for the wide circle of devastation the predators had created during the night. From above, the ring resembled an enormous burn mark on the sand, proof of both destruction and survival. The cadets joined him one by one, gathering along the rim like survivors emerging from a collapsed shelter. Some placed hands on the sand, touching the texture as if testing whether the ground truly belonged to them again. The instructors appeared on the far ridge in the distance, their silhouettes sharp against the rising suns. As they descended the slope, their postures were rigid with authority, but softened by something else: surprise. Mason recognized the subtle shift in their expressions. The instructors had expected casualties. They had expected hysteria, collapse, chaos. They had not expected this. When the lead instructor reached the edge of the destroyed ring, she paused, taking in the decoy pits, the hollow chamber, the cadets standing unharmed inside it. She approached slowly, her boots sinking lightly into the sand. She looked at Mason with a long, penetrating stare, then lowered her gaze to the shattered dunes around him. She knelt, pressed her fingertips against one of the pits, and examined the patterns with a practiced eye. The resemblance to real destruction was perfect, so perfect that the predators had accepted the illusion without hesitation. She rose and stepped toward Mason. For a moment she said nothing. Then, in a calm, measured voice, she asked him how he had known such a plan would work. Mason answered simply. The dunes had revealed the worm's behavior, and the behavior had revealed the solution. She studied him silently, her face unreadable. But something in her stance shifted: respect, or perhaps recognition. She had seen cadets survive trials before, but not like this. Survival born of panic or luck was common. Survival born of intellect, observation, and control was rare. Leary stepped forward then, her voice trembling as she explained how Mason had guided them through the night, how he had analyzed each vibration, how he had understood the predators before any of them had even identified the threat. The instructor listened, her expression remaining stern yet focused. When Leary finished, the instructor placed a hand gently on the cadet's shoulder, acknowledging her courage. Then she turned back to Mason. She told him that this trial had been designed to reveal which cadets could think beyond instinct. Careth 9 was often fatal because most species reacted to the predators the same way they reacted to threats on their home worlds, with fear, flight, or brute survival tactics. But this planet rewarded none of those approaches. It rewarded adaptation. It rewarded understanding. It rewarded those willing to see deeper than terror. The cadets gathered around Mason now, no longer merely relieved survivors, but individuals who understood that their continued existence hinged on the mind of one human who had refused to panic. Their expressions reflected a growing admiration and something even stronger: trust. Mason accepted their gazes with quiet humility. He had not acted to earn their awe. He had acted because doing nothing would have doomed every person on the dune that night. The instructor finally straightened and issued the formal words that marked the end of the trial. The night on Careth 9 was over. The cadets had passed. She instructed them to prepare for extraction. As she walked away, several cadets approached Mason, thanking him, some verbally, others with solemn nods. Leary stepped closer than the rest and whispered that without him, none of them would have lived. Mason met her gaze, offering a small smile. He reminded her that she had stood beside him when others hesitated. She had earned her survival as much as anyone. When the extraction craft descended toward the dunes with a roar of engines, blowing sand outward in billowing waves, Mason took one last look at the false village. The ring of pits gleamed faintly in the morning light, a testament to destruction that never truly happened. The predators had been fooled, the world had been outsmarted, and the cadets had lived because of it. As he boarded the craft with the others, Mason felt a quiet sense of closure. The sandworms would continue to roam the desert, hunting with the same brutal precision. The dunes would swallow new shelters in future trials. But the knowledge gained here, the understanding of a world that seemed impossible to survive, would remain with him and with everyone who witnessed the night. When the craft rose into the sky, leaving the shattered circle behind, Mason allowed himself to breathe deeply, for the first time without tension. The dawn over the false village marked not just survival, but the undeniable truth that on any world, no matter how hostile, a human mind could turn death into deception and danger into strategy. The trial on Careth 9 had proven it unmistakably. And as the desert shrank beneath the rising craft, Mason understood that this victory was more than just passing a test. It was a reminder of why humans carried a reputation that echoed across galaxies. They did not merely survive. They outthought the darkness itself,